Hi, this is Dr. Culkin. I'm here to talk about Topic 6, World War I and its consequences. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was elected in 1912. He soon lowered the tariff rates, implemented the income tax, and passed antitrust measures, or an income tax, I should say. As the economy worsened and more Republicans gained seats in 1914, it became harder for him to get legislation passed that he supported. Although he disappointed many African Americans, suffragists, and labor leaders who expected him to work harder for their causes, he did eventually endorse female suffrage after a long fight in which suffragists went under their way to embarrass him. And he also passed policies that did appeal to labor, such as child labor laws. Wilson was really not originally interested in foreign policy. He was focused on domestic affairs, but world events forced him to look abroad in a dramatic manner. As World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, the United States first declared a policy of neutrality. They weren't going to take sides on this war taking place on the other side of the ocean. An American entry into the war was very controversial. Many progressives saw it as a step backwards, endangering the lives of Americans just as they were fighting to make the lives of those Americans better in factories and through public health. And so many progressives became peace advocates, including Jane Addams, who we read about last week, and she was eventually labeled the most dangerous woman in America for her pacifist activities. Now, others felt the United States did have a loyalty to Britain and should come to its defense. Britain did limit the number of American goods which could enter Germany, angering Wilson, but the bigger threat came from the German U-boats or submarines, which sank ships with American passengers. When Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, many of his supporters campaigned on the idea that he had kept us out of the war. But at the same time, he was also ordering quietly an increase in military planning and spending. In December 1916, he attempted to involve the U.S. in negotiations between the Allies and Germany, hoping to keep the U.S. out of the war, hoping he could just end it. And he also gave a speech in which he talked about peace without victory, again, hoping to end the war before he would have to make a decision to have the U.S. enter into it. But soon Germany announced that it would begin sinking all ships that entered the waters around England and France. And then in February, Britain intercepted the Zimmermann telegram in which the Germans tried to form an alliance with Mexico by promising Mexico the land that it had lost to America in the Mexican-American War, which is basically most of the Southwest of the United States. Wilson almost immediately, on February 25th, 1917, told Congress of the contents of the Zimmermann telegram and asked for permission to arm merchant ships to fight off U-boats. Although Congress, led by Wisconsin Republican Robert La Follette, and you're going to read his speech this week in the discussion board, blocked the measure, Wilson went ahead and issued the order. And then on April 2nd, 1917, after 4 American ships had been sunk by German U-boats, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. Even with all the things that happened, it took 4 days for the resolution to be passed. And in the end, 50 members of the House and 6 senators voted against it. So this was not a war in which the United States politicians or its people were unanimously in support of the United States entry into it. The United States entered the war ill-prepared with an army that was small and sort of underarmed and undertrained. Wilson passed a draft act helping to build up the military. The battles that the 2.8 million Americans who were eventually inducted into the military fought were devastating, in large part because there were really new deadly weapons like poison gas and machine guns, which made the fighting even more brutal than it had ever been before. Now, as some Americans left to fight overseas, the people left behind participated in the war effort and experienced some drastic changes at home. The government took a bigger role in private industry than ever before. The War Industries Board oversaw factories, keeping a tight rein on what they could do and produce. The War Labor Board, hoping to keep peace at home with organized labor, protected workers' rights to organize. They did try to discourage strikes, coming up with other ways to negotiate, and insisted women be paid as much as men. Because of the labor shortage caused by men enlisting and immigration slowing, particularly from Europe during the war, women, African Americans, and Mexican Americans were able to take new sorts of jobs. These groups did often find higher wages during the war, again, because of the labor shortage. Demographic shifts occurred as many Southern African Americans moved north and many Mexicans moved into the Southwest United States. These migrations led to both new opportunities and new racial tensions as different groups of people came into contact with each other for the first time. Intolerance also thrived at the level of the federal government. There was a series of acts passed, including in 1918 the Sedition Act, which outlawed using disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language against the government. Well, in theory, the law was to protect the country from traitors' behavior. It, in fact, also was a curb on free speech and an attempt to get more support to this war that was still very unpopular among certain groups of people. Economically, the war served the country very well. Government contracts meant many industries expanded and thrived, including steel, aluminum, and cigarettes. It went from being the United States went from being a debtor nation, meaning it owed $3 billion to foreign investors, to being a creditor nation, meaning which other countries and investors owed the United States over $13 billion. So in general, the country did quite well. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice. Wilson met with other Allied leaders in Paris the following year to hammer out a treaty. He wanted to base it on his 14 points, which you should remember from History 10. If not, you might want to go review this in your textbook. And these were focused on ways to end the war in a way that was non-punitive and that would avoid future wars. He was still a progressive in that way. Now, although many points did not make it into the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty which ends the war, and they don't make it in there because France and England are in no mood to not be punitive, to not punish Germany for what they see as their aggressive behavior. The League of Nations does, however, come out of the Treaty of Versailles, which was one of his ideas, and that's the precursor to the UN, which, again, you might remember from History 10. But this treaty is not popular in the United States, where many senators feared interference from the League in domestic affairs. And even those that attempted to sort of compromise on that issue, when Wilson has a stroke, when he's out sort of campaigning for the treaty across the United States, it becomes impossible for him to advocate for the treaty effectively. And in fact, the U.S. never ratifies the treaty, and it's not until 3 years later that Congress passes a resolution officially ending the war. So the United States is officially at war for those 3 years, although, of course, in reality, it's not. Nothing's being fought. There's no money being spent on a war. Okay, so that's it for this week. Make sure that you participate in the discussion board and answer the reading questions, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks.